For 15 years, he was Chicago's worst taxi driver. Frank Morrison constantly took customers to wrong addresses, drove them around for hours, then apologized. Everyone thought he was incompetent. But that night, during the biggest organized crime operation, when the FBI tracked Frank's taxi, they were shocked. This man wasn't lost. This man was hunting. Frank Morrison, 62 years old, had worked as a taxi driver for Yellow Cab Chicago for 15 years. His yellow taxi, number 4847, was the most complained about vehicle in the company. Customers constantly complained. Wrong routes, unnecessary detours, extra charges. Frank would apologize every time, make excuses, but never changed. Company management had warned him several times but hadn't fired him. Because Frank always arrived on time, never called in sick, kept his car clean. He just had problems with driving. Dispatch supervisor Tommy Rodriguez hated Frank. Doesn't this guy know how to use GPS? He's lived in Chicago for 15 years and still mixes up the roads, he would constantly complain. Frank's customer rating was 2.15, the lowest company-wide. Customers had started calling Frank Lost Frank. Frank's name came up in Chicago taxi horror stories on social media. There were Reddit posts saying, "If you see Frank Morrison, call another taxi." But Frank didn't seem to care. Every morning he arrived at work at 6:00, left at 6:00 p.m. For 12 hours he would drive around the city, carry passengers, take wrong routes, and apologize. His routine never changed. Even Frank's wife Helen at home complained, "Frank, this job isn't for you. Retire already. You're 62. You don't need the stress." Frank would just smile. "I love this job, Helen. I meet people, see the city. But you're constantly getting lost." "Sometimes I need to be lost." Helen didn't understand this answer. She knew very little about Frank's past. She knew he had worked for the police before they married, but she had never asked for details. Frank wouldn't tell anyway. The truth was much more complex. Frank Morrison had worked as a detective for the Chicago Police Department from 1985 to 2010. But he wasn't just a detective, he was an undercover specialist. For 25 years, he had infiltrated the city's most dangerous organized crime groups, mafia, gangs, drug cartels. He had worked face-to-face with every type of criminal organization. He had taken early retirement in 2010. Official reason? Health issues. Real reason? Deep cover had lasted too long. He had developed PTSD. He wanted to return to normal life. But Chicago's underworld hadn't completely forgotten Frank. He still had contacts, still listened to informants, and taxi driving was perfect cover. No one would suspect. Frank's wrong routes weren't wrong at all. They were surveillance routes. He was checking suspicious addresses, monitoring illegal activities. He was giving tips to the FBI, but very subtly. That Friday evening, Frank was working his normal shift. He had picked up a customer downtown and was taking him to the north side. But his route was wrong again. Instead of Michigan Avenue, he was going via Lower Wacker Drive. The customer was annoyed. "Hey, this is the wrong way. You should have taken Michigan." Frank apologized. "Sorry, sir, there's construction. This is faster." In reality, there was a suspicious warehouse on Lower Wacker. Frank had gotten a tip from his informant Tony Castellano. There would be a big shipment tonight. Frank wanted to confirm. As they passed the warehouse, Frank noticed 6 black SUVs were parked. Unusual activity. He mentally noted the license plates. After dropping his customer at the destination, Frank parked in a parking lot and took out his encrypted phone. He called FBI Liaison Officer Agent Sarah Chen. "Chen, it's Frankie. Got something on Pier 19 warehouse. 6 black SUVs, Illinois plates. Looks like the shipment intel was correct." "Copy that, Frank. We're tracking. Stay clear of the area." "Roger." Frank hung up and continued his normal shift. Next customer, going to O'Hare Airport. Frank again took the wrong route, passing Pier 19 again. This time there were 8 SUVs and he could see armed men. He called Agent Chen again. "Activity increasing. Count now 8 vehicles, armed personnel visible." "Thanks, Frank. We're moving units into position. ETA 20 minutes. Frank dropped his customer at the airport, but on the way back he checked the Pier 19 area again. This time, he noticed FBI surveillance vans. The operation had begun. At 11:30 p.m., Frank was returning home. News came on the radio. Major drug bust on Chicago's north side. FBI arrested 12 suspects, seized over 50 kilograms of cocaine. Frank smiled. A successful day. The next morning, dispatch supervisor Tommy Rodriguez called Frank to the office. "Frank, we need to talk." Frank entered the office. Customer complaints were on Tommy's desk. "Frank, yesterday alone, 3 customers complained about wrong routes. Mrs. Peterson says you took her to the north side instead of Michigan Avenue. What's your explanation?" Frank shrugged. "Traffic was heavy. I thought Lower Wacker would be faster." "Frank, you've been doing this for 15 years. How can you still get lost?" "Sometimes GPS acts up." Tommy was angry. "Frank, I'm giving you one last warning. Next complaint, you're out. Clear?" "Clear, Tommy." Frank left the office smiling. If Tommy knew that Frank had caused 12 drug dealers to be arrested last night. That afternoon, Frank went to the FBI field office during his lunch break. He had a meeting with Agent Chen. "Great work last night, Frank. That tip led to the biggest cocaine bust this year." "Just doing my part." "Frank, we have another situation. Vincent Torino's crew is planning something big. We need eyes on their operations." Frank thought. Vincent Torino was one of Chicago's most dangerous crime bosses. Frank had had dealings with him during his undercover days. What kind of surveillance? Mobile surveillance. They're using multiple locations, constantly moving. We need someone who can follow without being noticed. Frank grinned. Someone who looks lost all the time? Exactly. Agent Chen handed Frank a file. Known associates, vehicle descriptions, suspected meeting locations. We need you to track their movements. Frank reviewed the file. There were familiar names. Torino's lieutenants, Marco Santelli, Bobby the Fish Castellano, Jimmy Torino, Vincent's cousin. "When do I start?" "Tonight. Torino has a suspected meeting, Millennium Park area." Frank nodded. "I'll be there." That evening, Frank worked his normal shift but carefully planned his routes. He cruised areas near Millennium Park, taking customers to different places. At 9:30 p.m., after dropping off a customer, Frank began waiting in the Grant Park area. 10 minutes later, he saw Vincent Torino's black Mercedes, 2 escort vehicles behind it. Frank began following. Torino's Mercedes turned onto Michigan Avenue, then Wacker Drive. Frank followed at a 3-car distance. The Mercedes entered a parking garage. Frank passed by, went around the block, came back. He checked vehicles exiting the garage. He took out his phone. "Chen, target entered parking garage on Lower Wacker. 3 vehicles total." "Copy, we have units in the area." Frank stayed in the area for 2 hours, picking up different customers, but always in that vicinity. At 11:45 p.m., Torino's Mercedes exited the garage. Frank began following again. This time, the Mercedes went to Navy Pier. Frank kept his distance, parked in the pier area. 4 people got out of the Mercedes: Torino, Santelli, Castellano, and a man he didn't recognize. Another group was waiting at the pier. Frank took out binoculars, recorded license plates. "Chen, target at Navy Pier, meeting with unknown group. Looks like a handoff." "Roger, units moving in." Frank's phone rang. It was Tommy Rodriguez. "Frank, where the hell are you? Your customer is waiting for you at Navy Pier. Where are you?" Frank panicked. "Sorry, Tommy, GPS error. On my way." "Frank, this is ridiculous. The customer will complain again." Frank hung up. It was a professional hazard. He had to maintain cover. The meeting at Navy Pier was completed. Torino's group left. Frank followed them, but had to be careful. If he got caught, the Mercedes returned downtown, dropped Torino at a hotel. Frank reported the location, finished his shift. The next morning, when Frank came to the office, Tommy Rodriguez was very angry. "Frank, office now!" Frank entered the office. There were 5 complaint forms on Tommy's desk. "Frank, enough is enough. Yesterday, wrong route to Navy Pier, wrong route to Michigan Avenue, wrong route to O'Hare. 5 complaints in one day." Frank tried to apologize. "Tommy, I can explain." "No explanations. You're fired, Frank, effective immediately." Frank's heart sank. He had lost his cover job. "Tommy, please, I need this job." Should have thought about that before getting lost for the 100th time. Frank left the office. His 15-year cover identity was over. That afternoon, he called Agent Chen. "We have a problem. I got fired." "What? Why?" "Too many customer complaints about wrong routes. Cover's blown." Agent Chen fell silent. "Frank, this is serious. We're in the middle of the Torino investigation. We need your surveillance." "I know, but without taxi cover, I can't do mobile surveillance. Let me think about this." 2 hours later, Agent Chen called back. "Frank, I talked to my supervisor. We're creating a new cover for you." "What kind of cover?" "Private security consultant. We'll give you different vehicles, different routes. Torino won't suspect." Frank felt relieved. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow. And Frank, this time try not to get fired." Frank laughed. "I'll do my best." That evening at home, he gave Helen the bad news. "I got fired today." Helen was sympathetic. "Oh, Frank, I'm sorry, but maybe it's for the best. You were always getting lost anyway." Frank smiled. "Yeah, maybe it's time for a new direction." "What will you do now?" "I'm thinking private security consulting." Helen was surprised. "Security? Frank, you have no background in security." Frank paused. "Actually, I have more background than you think." Helen looked curiously. "What do you mean?" Frank decided it was time. "Helen, I need to tell you something about my past." That night, Frank told Helen about his real past. His 25-year undercover career, collaboration with the FBI, ongoing investigations. Helen was shocked. "You mean all these years when customers complained about you getting lost?" "I wasn't lost. I was hunting." Helen processed this information. "And the taxi job?" "Perfect cover. No one suspects a lost taxi driver." Helen grinned. "Frank Morrison, you sneaky bastard." Frank laughed. "Sorry for the secrecy. It was necessary." "So what happens now?" "Now I continue the work, but with a different cover." Helen nodded. "Just try not to get fired from the next job, too." Frank winked. "I'll try to be less obvious about getting lost." A week later, Frank established Morrison Security Consulting. FBI funded, but civilian appearance, office downtown, professional appearance. The Vincent Torino investigation continued. Frank was no longer a taxi driver. He was a security consultant. Different vehicles, different routes, but same mission. 3 months later, Torino and his entire organization were arrested. Frank's surveillance had provided critical evidence. During the trial, Frank testified as a witness. The defense attorney was confused. "Mr. Morrison, you claim to be a security consultant, but our investigation shows you worked as a taxi driver." Frank smiled. "Sometimes the best security work is done by people who appear to be something else entirely." "And the customer complaints about you getting lost?" "I was never lost, counselor. I was exactly where I needed to be." The judge was impressed. "Mr. Morrison, your undercover work led to this major bust. The court appreciates your service." Frank nodded. "Just doing my job, Your Honor." After Torino's conviction, Frank continued his legitimate security consulting business, but collaboration with the FBI continued. A year later, Frank visited his old taxi company. He went to see Tommy Rodriguez. "Tommy?" Tommy was surprised. "Frank, how are you? I heard you started a security business." "Yeah, it's going well." Tommy was awkward. "Frank, about firing you? I had no choice. Customer complaints." Frank grinned. "Tommy, those customer complaints led to the arrest of Chicago's most dangerous crime boss." Tommy was confused. "What do you mean?" "Those wrong routes I took, they were surveillance routes. I was working with the FBI." Tommy's jaw dropped. "You mean you were never actually lost?" "Never lost, Tommy, just hunting." Tommy shook his head. "Frank Morrison, you son of a bitch, you had us all fooled." Frank laughed. Sometimes the best disguise is incompetence. As Frank left the taxi company, he was laughing. For 15 years, he had been Chicago's worst taxi driver, but in reality, he was the city's most effective undercover agent. Because sometimes appearing lost ensures you're exactly where you need to be. And Frank Morrison was never really lost. He was always in the right place.